And we are live. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to a special stream with me and my good friend Intermezzo. How you doing, man?
I'm doing well. How are you doing?
I'm pretty good, thank you very much. We originally got this idea over that essay that I sent you by a Peruvian writer called Mario Vargas Llosa,
Yeah.
um, involving his thoughts on terrorism. But it kind of opened the door for a new discussion regarding democracy and our feelings or disillusionment with it.
Yeah, yes. It was a very interesting essay, and essentially what he goes through is he's trying to understand why is there more terror toward he describes two societies. One of I believe was it Peru
It was,
before.
yes.
So it was before during a dictatorship, and I'm unfamiliar with the dictatorship, and then afterwards during the democracy, and the rise of the terrorism after the totalitarian regime, if I'm not correct, if I'm not
Yeah,
mistaken. Is that correct?
you are. You see, and the funny thing is that this regime was actually a left-leaning military regime, from around, I believe, 67 to give or take the early 80s.
Hmm.
Um, and then, ironically, it was followed by another dictatorship in 1992,
Hmm.
which then proceeded for the next 10 or so years. So, Peru, actually, I find through my knowledge of it, and as you know, I have extensive, contacts within Peru.
Yeah.
Um, they always have this kind of problem once the totalitarian state is at an end.
Hmm.
And I actually think that that is a significant weakness with democracy. It enables this kind of activity to flourish because the state no longer keeps an eye out for these sorts of people, these undesirables, the socialists, the troublemakers, the revolutionaries. They start to go under the radar. And
Hmm.
then it gets to that stage where sooner or later the local police can't handle it and it just spirals from there.
Hmm. I kind of agree. So I think what you're trying to say is that during a democracy, it's easier for essentially radical movements to propagate because people don't have essentially the fortitude to stand up against more radical opinions that could potentially challenge the status quo, leading to a totalitarian regime. Is that what you're trying to say?
Yes, yes, it is. And
And
I'm sorry.
oh no, and I generally tend to agree. This is one of the soft spots of quote. It's kind of a liberal democracy, and so in this liberal democracy, when you only have negative rights and you don't have positive rights, you essentially don't have a political immune system, if you will, against these radical types. You're hoping that people will see reason, and most of the time they likely do. But in some cases, it makes people susceptible to these radical ideologies that can potentially overthrow the democratic structure. And I think this is the big issue in the case of Peru, since it doesn't have the democratic tradition that other countries do have, such as Canada and the United States. So it's much more prone to these overthrows, if you will.
Well, I find like what I've experienced in South America in general is actually they don't usually tend towards democracy. I mean, they love to talk about it. They love to say,
Yes.
how much they'd want this, quote unquote liberty. But of course, as you know, liberty and human rights can sometimes be a rather subjective thing. Um, but I find that they move towards what is called caudillos, which is like a strong man, someone who can handle the problems that are plaguing the country when democracy fails. And places like Peru and Chile and Argentina and honestly, South America as a whole has, during one point or another, had these dictators or these caudillos, these strongmen,
Yes.
and it's in a response to a perceived weakness, either with a previous dictator or generally, honestly, with democracy.
Hmm.
Um, And I think, in places that like the United States, where you have this powerful tradition of democracy, much more than you do Canada, to be honest, because I feel that republics with that long tradition of uninterrupted, democracy have a stronger tie to it, whereas us, where we have a mixed system, a constitutional monarchy with a democratic elected government serving under the Queen. Um, we tend to take our democratic rights a little more for granted, I believe. And lately, I'm actually seeing, though, in the United States at least, is the weaknesses in democracy, as you see the rise of Antifa, you see the rise of certain, right wing elements. They're they're not as bad, in the right wing as people let them on to believe. I think Antifa is much more of a serious threat, and have encouraged the polarization that we see today.
Yeah, I agree that NFA is much more of a threat than any of the right wing groups, to be honest. I kind of feel like the right wing groups, they're just kind of they're they're very, very well controlled by outside institutions. Like they don't get very much. They don't get very much press, and whatever press they do get is extremely negative. And so that kind of curtails the rise of these right-wing groups, as opposed to Antifa. I don't see them getting as much press. They are typically called like they're typically seen as either like protesters against right-wingers or something like that, or it's in very benign terms. And in general, I kind of feel like Antifa does kind of have these special protections, just kind of like the socialists in our country, to be honest. I don't feel like the socialists have much power. I don't feel like I'm sure that you've heard of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who I don't believe has really I don't believe that
Yeah.
she has any power either. To be honest, I kind of view them as simply individuals that are used by the more liberal establishment, kind of as how in the past that there have been paramilitary groups that kind of fight a war on behalf of a larger country. Well, these are kind of like the parapolitical groups that essentially try to move the Overton window to a degree, and they kind of they essentially they fight right wing groups and right wing kind of like even like moderate liberals and even like mild left wingers to a degree in an attempt to discredit them to strengthen the political base of the kind of more moderate liberal establishment.
No, and I agree with you there, and but I feel though that this can backfire. Like, what if the way you describe it is true?
Yeah.
For example, I mean, we can't forget that, and I hate to use this one, but as a perfect example is Hitler. It At first, when these people, when the German establishment of the Weimar Republic got involved with Adolf Hitler, they thought he was only going to be a malleable figurehead. They would get him in power and then do as they pleased. And then it turned out that once he had the power that he needed, he stopped playing, I'm going to obey you, and instead he was, you fall in line with me or you're dead. And so I think the left is playing a very dangerous game, especially the Democratic establishment. I mean, they're sacrificing several of their long term sitting members for these young, supposedly bright eyed, wildly idealistic socialists,
Yeah.
but and they think that they can maintain their power by getting these young people to attract the millennials and that. But it's going to backfire. I mean, it always will, because sooner or later these people will realize that, hey, I've got the power, not Nancy Pelosi, not Chuck Schumer. I have it, and I have the influence, and I have the stage. And then the establishment is going to start dancing to their tune, and it's not going to be good, because despite what we may think, they might not be a threat now, but people who you discount generally as a threat never usually are considered one until it's too late. So while I think they're not a big deal as of yet, I still think that we shouldn't take them completely for granted and just say, you know, they're nothing. They're not going to be anything, because they will worm their way in. Just as, you know, in a lot of universities now, it's an incredibly left-leaning direction. I mean, people didn't think that would happen, but it did. And it took a long time, but by God, it made it there.
Yeah. No, I agree. I don't think that the liberal establishment can keep these people under wraps for too long. And eventually, I wouldn't be surprised if the liberal establishment does eventually try to reach back towards the middle and tries to curtail these groups a bit. I don't know if that will be within 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, but I think so. In my opinion, I think the liberal establishment is largely these large corporations who are very materialistic, and they just want, you know, material wealth, and they're the people who admire, you know, the rising, you know, like Dow Jones and the rising, you know, stock prices. And I think that they'll throw them under the bus sooner or later. The question is when. I think that they'll just stop supporting them after they fail to win an election or something like that. Now, I do think that, unfortunately, the general society is just becoming more radicalized in general, which will make these positions stronger relative to the establishment, despite the lack of institutional support. For example, I do think in the next 10, 20 years that despite the fact that the establishment will start essentially fighting against these Antifa groups and stuff like that, or at least they won't be marketing them as doing the Lord's work, so to speak, I still think that these groups are going to rise in power and importance, just as, you know, the current liberal paradigm collapses because essentially it's not sustainable. It's kind of running on fumes right now. It's like a red giant essentially prior to supernova. You know, you're kind of running on the last atoms of iron and other massive massive atomic particles that can't really sustain a ember for very long before a collapse. But but yeah, I do think that the establishment is eventually going to fight Antifa later on, perhaps in about 5, 10 years. But I don't think it will.
But oh, sorry to interrupt you. But do you think though that by the time they really realize that they made a mistake, it's going to be too late? Because I mean, right now they are growing in strength, and I mean they are evolving as in a sense, because they're no longer just, you know, a black bloc. They're now armed. I mean, you see Antifa demonstrators going around with bats and airsoft guns and you know, combustible explosives. You know, it's getting concerning, and I mean,
I 100% agree. I think that I think it's already out of hand. I think that they've already pushed one domino too far, and it's just going to get bigger and bigger and bigger. But I think this is largely due to the other policies and other issues with liberal democracy, as opposed to really this kind of more like marketing campaign in the media is showing them as like freedom warriors or whatnot.
and that's true, but I think, you know, it comes down to, you know, what we originally were discussing here, wherein this is the weakness with this liberal democracy. Whereas I believe you say in a you know, a more authoritarian regime, I think that these people would be suppressed immediately. I mean, they would be driven underground and their leadership would be discovered and eliminated. I mean,
Oh, of course.
this is what most of these, you know, authoritarian governments have done. And honestly, as terrifying as it is to say, it's incredibly effective for peace. Because I mean, while you don't have that democracy, you know, that everyone seems to crave, you have something that is just as good, which is stability. And I know people who have lived through military dictatorships. I know one who lived through one in El Salvador. I know one who've been through when Fujimori was in charge in Peru in the 90s. And the one in El Salvador, he just told me, he's like, look, he said, honestly, despite what everyone says about military dictatorships, it wasn't that bad. He said, sure, you had to keep your opinions to yourself, but as long as you kept your head down and did your job, there was no problems. The food was on the table. You paid your bills. You could save up some money, go to the countryside for a little vacation. and all we had to give up was voting. And he said, honestly, I didn't mind that, because when I had to vote, I was just voting for the same group of idiots each time. And I I thought about that for a while, because I mean, this is someone who has come from a completely different way of life, who grew up in, these successive military regimes. Um, and he's just telling me, he's like, look, it was bad, but it was stable.
Mhm.
And generally that's all human beings really want. I mean, we have this yearning for liberty. I mean, all of us generally have that innate yearning for it, at least in the West. But really, what is liberty per se? You know what I mean? I
Yeah. So this actually kind of reminds me of like the philosophical differences between Jean-Jacques Rousseau and Joseph de Maistre.
mm,
When Jean-Jacques Rousseau essentially says, man is born to be free, but he finds himself everywhere in chains. And he has to liberate himself from all these oppressive institutions and become free and become an individual. And with this radical freedom, then one can truly become themselves and they can build the best society. And this has essentially been almost the calling card of many liberal institutions, or at least is the ideal proposed by many of these liberal democracies. And then, of course, you have de Maistre, who's largely ignored today, who he says, to respond to that quote, he says, yes, everywhere man is free and born to, yet is found in chains. He responds to this by saying, yes, and everywhere sheep are carnivorous, but yet everywhere munch on grass. It's not what we really want. We say that we want freedom, but we really don't. And we really want we want a stability so that we can order our lives.
and we want a leadership. We want that figure that we can rally around, per se, be it the local mayor, the local governor or premier, in the case of Canada, or your prime minister or your president. You always want that one individual, because I mean, in that's why we don't have direct democracy. We elect somebody, we say, go to this building, spend most of your year there, make our decisions for us, and please make sure that you make them in the way that you would assume we do, and then come back, and here's your paycheck, have a nice day. We don't really make these decisions ourselves. I mean, we don't usually come up with the policies, the in terms of domestic and foreign. We don't do that. We don't call our representatives and say, look, Chuck Schumer, I want you to look at a free trade agreement with Paraguay. We just give it to them every so many years, and then we go about our lives, and then when they do something we don't like, we get angry, and then the cycle repeats itself. We find someone else who's going to, assumedly, we assume, do our will, you
Mm-hmm.
know, and really that's not really very democratic, because I mean, we're essentially just giving the power to somebody else and telling them to do with it what they will. I mean, democracy, like, at least my form of democracy here in Canada, is essentially a temporary dictatorship, especially if you have a majority government.
Well, that's true. But then again, I think when we talk about democracy, we don't really talk about pure democracy. I mean, even Athens was not pure democracy. Pure democracy is really essentially impossible unless you have a small enough population that everyone can be heard. And that's not really the case in any population of people today. So I think it's not very useful talking about democracy in general, except for inside the context of a democratic republic.
Yes, and that's
But I
true.
do think that, like, you're right, as in the kind of what we say, like what we think about when we think about democracy. We think of, each and every individual person making decisions that will eventually affect the government. But as I think is actually covered in the article that you sent me, it really does. I think everybody to some degree knows that democracy as itself is kind of, it's not really this idealistic democracy that we envision. It's really kind of, it's essentially people who are at the top who really select who we vote for and who select which topics are going to be covered. And
It is.
And so in this way, even like what you were talking about, like this transient dictatorship that becomes democratic every 4 or so years, it's not even that really, because our choices are very limited politically.
Oh, definitely. Like here in Newfoundland, especially. I mean, we have a three-party system, just as you in the United States have a two-party system. And everyone says, well, listen, there's other parties, there's other candidates who can be run. But you see, that's only really an illusion because you, me, and the dog knows that these people are not going to get in unless there's some sort of miracle. I mean, it's very, very slim chances. I mean, you're never going to see the Libertarian Party, get a majority in Congress, not unless something goes horribly off the rails in terms of the establishment. These choices are merely just window dressing to improve the illusion of free and democratic choice. But in reality, you're only giving two options on the menu to choose from. And either way, generally those options are going to taste the exact same.
Yeah, I think to a degree you're right. And another issue is that, of course, when it comes to the twin parties, is that they're not really that different at the end of the day. I think really, especially here in the United States, they're actually remarkably similar. The only real difference is on social issues. And then they always essentially people don't realize that they just use none of them really care about the social issues. They're just using the social issues to get more votes. They don't really give a damn about any of them. But what happens though is that in this twin party system here in the United States, at least, most of these parties are just both beholden to other people who have more connections and the like, and I don't really think that people are being like like a malevolent in this regard. I don't think that anybody goes over to DC, who's a senator and says, "Oh, I'm going to be corrupt" or whatnot. But it's very easy for somebody to go to DC, either a congressman or even the president or Supreme Court justice or whatnot, and what they see is what they tell themselves at least is, "Hey, I'm going to be a good person." And this action, although it looks bad on the cover, it will bring about better results in the future. So a lot of people bring up this idea that, hey, there's corporate interests and that they're taking Washington by storm, which to a degree, yes, that's true. But I think it's because with lobbying, they're able to convince people in political power that, hey, if my company, if Target does well, then Target will have an increased stock price. And then more people will get more retirement savings, and that's better for people who are approaching retirement. And so, if we benefit Target, we're benefiting the United States. We have this notion, and this is both present in the Republican and the Democratic parties.
Definitely.
I find it odd that people, historically, even as of 5-10 years ago, they really honestly believed that the Democratic was not a pro-corporate party, which of course it is. It's a very pro, international corporation party, and
yes.
yeah, and I think this is kind of toxic for society, and this is mostly because I'm a believer in subsidiarity. I don't think that these companies should be getting this big. And
I agree. I'm more of a small business focused kind of guy. Like I believe in, small localized businesses. I don't believe any corporation, no matter how, successful they are with their business model, should get to that point where they can dominate in such a way, like the Walmarts and that.
Yes, and I agree with you. And I think if you were to poll 100 people, about 99% of them would agree with you that they like that, at least at some basal level, that they would prefer to have smaller companies, with the whole history and story behind them, as opposed to these big behemoths. But a number of people, they tend to believe that whatever is best for these large companies is better for the economy, and so therefore they're going to go vote in their favor, or they will vote for a representative and they will be unaware that this representative is beholden to these large corporate interests. And so it's very, very difficult. Like through a democracy, it's almost impossible to go do it, because it's indisputable that when these companies do well, the stock market improves. And how do we measure the economy? It's by the stock market. It's by GDP. And what people fail to really recognize is that, the stock market, GDP, and all these other things, like they're not the you can't build a society upon this, and this is not going to help small town America very much.
But
it's
they
not
don't
going to
care
help.
about. Sorry to cut you off there, but most people generally don't care about small town America or small town Canada. For all their talk of it, it's honestly the last thing on their minds. I mean, for them, the future is in these large urban centers. That's why you see so little encouragement for industrialization of the rural heartland. You don't want to see factories put out in, I don't know, Iowa and Montana. You want them in New York, Chicago, formerly Detroit before it.
Well, they're not building factories, period, in the United States very much anymore. They're building them. But I agree. They're trying to drive, we're kind of in a service-based economy, and they're building up all these services and all these things over in the larger cities. I agree. I don't know how to really reverse that. Well, it's just kind of, I don't, like, the more and more I think about it, the less and less I think politics can actually do to help these communities out, other than essentially just try to leave them alone and try to encourage people to formulate the local economy. But then you have issues there too, because, who can really build the local economy? And it's the people who are the brightest in the community. And when essentially, when you have the people who are the brightest in the community and then they go off to college, they're not going to return back to their communities where they come from. They're going to go off to some big city. And
that's a problem that we have here, to be honest. I mean, I know where I live is rather irrelevant in the grand scheme of things, and to many people who would probably tune in, they'd probably wonder, why does it matter? But I mean, where I live, in Newfoundland, is the perfect example, because I've done it myself. I went to college, and then I went off to a much larger city, because there was opportunity. And most people don't want to go back to their rural towns, because what's there? I mean, there's nothing to do generally.
I mean, but I kind of disagree a bit. I think that there is a lot you can do in the local communities. I think that we're marketed, though, that there's, look at everything that you can do in a city. Look at all the opportunities. When I do think that there are a lot of opportunities in small towns.
No. Economically, yes, but I mean, it's just the way we've been wired.
Yeah, but the issue is that when you go to college, a college degree doesn't help you build a company. It doesn't help you start your own business. It doesn't help you do any of that. What a college degree is, it's essentially, and I've heard this before, how there's a fit for human consumption label that you can go put on food products. Well, this is a fit for business consumption. This is essentially, you go get one of these college diplomas and then you work for some big company. You don't need a college diploma to work for a small one. And so essentially, especially here in the United States, when you load up everybody with so much college debt that they can't even really consider building their own business. And in college, they're not taught how to be like an entrepreneur. They're not taught how to really, truly use their talents to benefit society in some unique or interesting way. They're told how to be a corporate servant, essentially. They're taught how to work for a big company. And so when you're taught your whole life, you need to go to high school, then you need to go to college. And when you're in college, you need to work for a big company. You're not going to have the mindset to go back to the small town which you come from, because you're not even going to know how to start a business, let alone how to build a good one. You're not going to know how to be a pillar of your community. All what you're going to know is how to go work for some big company, make a reasonable paycheck, depending upon what major you are, how well you did. And some people don't even do that. Some people, they are like baristas or whatnot. You can't make a living off that.
No,
but essentially, what happens is that they make a reasonable income. They're not going to go back to the place where they come from. And I think that's also contributing to the death of these communities, to the death of the culture of these communities. And one of the reasons why people always say, oh, it's not any fun to live in one of these small communities. Although I think if people actually did return, you know, there would be something to do because people would make something to do.
And they would, but like you said, it's just the way we've got ourselves taught. And what you said about the small business, about, you know, people not coming into university and not knowing how to start a business, that's true, because I know so many people in this town who never went and did university. They just they either went and got, like, say, plumbing or electrical or heavy equipment operator, and then they went and started their own businesses, and it takes off. And and meanwhile, you know, you've got people, and they're making, you know, maybe $100,000-$200,000 a year, if they're, you know, good at what they're doing. And then you've got people, you know, who spent, you know, X amount of years in university, got a master's or a PhD in this field or that field, and they're probably pulling in, maybe, I don't know, starting off 50 to 60,000, and they've probably got about 100,000 of debt, and plus other expenses they have to deal with in that, and it keeps them, you know, locked down and just drained. And that's how you that spirit dies, essentially, because I mean, people don't, you know, they don't break that mold. They're too busy focused on, you know, getting out of this hole that they've dug for themselves, this debt hole. And then once, by the time, you know, they get that paid off, it's, you know, the fire is gone. You know, they don't have the same ideas that they did, or maybe they think that, you know, the only way I'm going to get anywhere is by, I don't know, working for IBM or for one of the larger companies as a 9 to 5. That's the only way I'm going to make it. I don't want to take, or even I don't want to take the risk starting a small business. I'm terrified of it. You know, I'm terrified of the expense, the idea of going into significant debt, or failing, you know, or that embarrassment and humiliation. I mean, these things really deter people from starting business. And honestly, too, you know what? It's also your government, your local government, your state government, your federal government. All the different things they have put together really discourage people, and it just kills it. And it comes down to that disillusionment with democracy,
Yeah.
because you mean, you rely on your government, you elect these people in the idea that they're going to make things better for you as either a citizen or a business owner, and 9 chances out of 10 they usually don't. They make it better for the bureaucrats. They don't really make it any better for you.
Yeah. I would like to go touch on one thing that you brought up,
Sure.
that people are afraid of failure. And I've noticed this, and perhaps this is because, you know, I'm of the upper middle class, and I went to a very respectable university, like one of the top 15 universities in the US. And I'm in a very, you know, kind of like I'm doing fairly well off in my field. Yeah, well, not only I'm comfortable, but I'm with other people who are comfortable as well. And from what I've noticed, like I'm from the people who, like, I think in theory should be forming the backbones of these societies, the people who should be stepping up, the people who should be the leaders in their communities, and the people who should be building the businesses. You know, the people who are intelligent, who are well educated, the people who have, you know, both the social and technical skills likely to actually build a business that thrives. I mean, they're not taught very well in college, of course, but in theory, these are the people who should be like, who are missing in our society today. And I'll tell you that a lot of these people, they simply lack the courage to do anything. They simply lack the courage to stand up. They simply lack the courage to build a business. They lack the courage to go back to their communities. And it's not only that they don't care, it's just that the ones that, even the people who do care, they quickly, like, essentially talk themselves out of caring simply because they don't have the courage to do so. It actually reminds me. So I did take this entrepreneurship class when I was in college. You know, it was like kind of like a freebie 1 credit class. Why the hell not? But essentially, I remember there was this one guy who came in and he was talking about how, you know, you really have to have courage to be an entrepreneur. about how it's very difficult. You're probably going to fail a couple of times. You're going to have to go bankrupt. It's going to be stressful for your family at times. It's going to be difficult to have a family at times. And you kind of just need to grit through it and know, hey, you need to come up with good ideas. You need to be always up on your feet, and you need to have courage. And I remember during that presentation, he was talking about how you probably need more courage to be an entrepreneur than most other fields. And I remember this one woman, she kind of announced to him, because this was in an entrepreneurship and science class. And this lady was eventually, she was trained to go to medical school. And she said, "Oh, you don't think it takes courage to go to medical school?" And like the guy, he kind of sat there kind of stunned, and he tried to be like political about it, saying, "Yes, but I mean, you know," he would just go off and say, "Hey, entrepreneurship, you know, there are risks in entrepreneurship that people in medical school don't necessarily have. You know, most people who go to medical school graduate from medical school, and most people have a comfortable job afterwards and all that." And having gone through so like I've been through medical school and gone through the process, and I can go tell you, yes, you're stressed out sometimes, but it doesn't take a lot of courage once you've been accepted to medical school to actually go to medical school. It might be difficult when you're actually on the job and you confront patients who are difficult or who are in the process of dying or something like that, but it doesn't take very much courage to like get that initial acceptance and to go through medical school and to, you know, I mean, if you want to go get kind of a, you know, you can go tailor your medical career to your interests. It doesn't take as much courage to go to medicine as it does to be an entrepreneur, especially in our society, because, you know, you don't have to, you know, when you fail, as, you know, when one of your patients dies or something like that, in some ways, you know, I hate to say this, but, you know, it's going to happen. And I think in regards to entrepreneurship, you know, and we see a business failing, some part in our gut tells us that, hey, I'm not supposed to fail in this way, that this is all on me, and that, you know, I could have done better, and it destroys the person because they're afraid to fail in that way. They're afraid to try something that will fail. And so I feel like this really kills off much of the entrepreneurial spirit of our upper middle class, because they don't want to fail. They would rather take a job that, although might not be comfortable, you know, like let's go say a person on Wall Street, you know, it's very, very difficult to get in. And once you're there, it's not necessarily a comfortable job, but at least it has some stability there. Yes, at least, you know, at the end of the day, you're an employee and you have, you know, you have employment, you have a source of income. You're not going to be like an entrepreneur, like hoping that you get an income at the end of the day. And you're not going to, you don't have to blame yourself for your failures. And so it's a different type of courage that our middle class generally tends to lack, in my view.
No, and it's definitely this. I think it's the same throughout the Western world, really. And I just want to touch on what you say there about people. You know, it's that stability. It's they don't have to worry about their income at the end of the day, because they want all of the. I find a lot of people when they gain unemployment with one of these companies, or should I say gain employment? I'm sorry, with these companies, they want all of the benefits but none of the risk, and that's really the best way to describe it. Because, I mean, if you're managing a company and that company goes under, that's fine. You know, it's you're out of a job, yes, but you're not straddled with the debt and you know, having to deal with what's left of the assets of that company. You know, you just say, well, that was fun, time to go look for another job, and off you go on your merry way. And whoever owns the company has to pick up the pieces. And so I think that's true. And I mean, I find that we as a society do not encourage this enough. I mean, we don't encourage just small business enough. We don't encourage people to take that risk, to be entrepreneurs, to boldly go where no one has gone before. We really encourage people to play it safe and leave it to somebody else that's already established.
Well, I think we tell people to take risks by saying, I mean, like, this is one of the reasons why I think people are really driven to the left. You know, they're told, oh, you need to be unique, you need to take risks. but they try to take comfortable risks. You know, it's comfortable to have a left-wing opinion because you're not really opposed by anybody in the media, and it kind of feels like you're taking a risk, but you're really not.
You're being a revolutionary, yet you're still mainstream, and you can go home and relax without any risk. Whereas, you know, someone who is conservative and say, for example, says, I'm like, here we've recently had birthright citizenship come up here in Canada, and I've come out and say, listen, I to an extent, I don't approve of it. There should be, you know, certain limits to this. I got called out. I got yelled at. I got called things that I'm most certainly not. I actually had to go on a radio station and defend myself. And luckily I did it well, and I spoke with conviction on what I believe in. But I mean, it was still a torturous experience. Whereas somebody can put on a pink hat, scream a bunch of mindless slogans, feel like they've accomplished something, and go home without any trouble.
Agreed, and have your pink hat paid for by Target.
Exactly.
Have a march planned by the city in which you live, and you know, I've been in, like, I've had maybe I have another thing because I have a story about this, about how I couldn't get to a place of work because they had this parade going on, and I was a couple minutes late because I didn't realize it at the time, and so I was like sitting behind all these protesters. But which was a fault on my part. You know, I should have planned for it, but it just kind of makes me think, oh, this is just so corporate, you know, which of course, like, corporations, you know, when it comes to when it comes to a lot of these things, like concerning, you know, women's rights, it really fits the companies to be kind of on the quote progressive end of things, because it really benefits them from a materialistic perspective, in my opinion. You know, it gets people out to go buy their shit and whatnot.
No, it really does. I mean, look at the Colin Kaepernick thing, for example. I mean, it's maddening that he got to where he is, but I mean, that's the risk. That's the hill Nike wants to go on, and I mean, no. And
so maybe I'm not actually too familiar about Nike and Colin Kaepernick. Could you inform me as to what happened?
They have taken him on as a spokesperson for a new campaign, because and it's essentially him being like, you know, making, you know, the right choices even if they're not popular. That's essentially it.
Even though his choice was fairly popular, especially amongst people who buy the Nike brand.
Yeah.
I mean, like, let's be honest here. In general, I tend to view Nike as, you know, it's a shoe that's bought by liberal people who live in liberal cities.
And the funny thing is that it's also generally made by child labor or something.
I mean, it is a very, very corrupt company, and so it's ironies abound. But then again, you know, I think this just proves just how materialistic our society is. That even like our what we think is moral judgments, that even our ethics is really driven by consumer culture.
Oh, it is. And I mean, that's what strays us away from the right path, as it were. You know, this absolute obsession with, you know, status, materialism, things like that. Because, and I actually think that's what brings U.S. democracy especially off the rails, because I don't think your founding fathers really thought about, you know, Nike and Apple and things like that becoming that influential and powerful in your society.
Well, you know? I think they also didn't. So there are a lot of new things in our society that I don't think anybody could have accounted for. So, and this is like one thing. Most people in America don't really, specifically under the age of 30 or so, don't really consider themselves American. I mean, like, they'll say, oh, I have American citizenship, or, oh, I have, like, they might pay lip service to it. But, you know, a lot of, like, I know high school friends who've left the country, you know, and they're just as happy. You know, they don't feel any less of a person because they left. You know, the American identity is dead. It's not present. And so
in Canada, oh, sorry.
Yeah, no, and so the American identity, what is it? It's really just a platform for some like person up on a stage for them to say, "Oh, I believe American values is this," but really the whole core of America is dead. There is nothing that makes you an American anymore, and I think that was killed off. I don't know when, but you go talk to anybody my age, even me, like I don't even know what it is to be really an American anymore. I don't really feel like a connection with the country as much as perhaps my grandparents did back when they were younger.
And
And and how do you build a society? How do you build, people who really care about anything other than material goods or services in the United States, given that nobody really, when they view America, they just view, oh, it's just a collection of my political opinions, or it's just like it is whatever identity I choose to have today. I mean, the whole notion of an American identity is dead.
well, it's the same here, though. Really, I mean, I think we're in a, I dare to say, a nationalistic, or post nation sense of identity, because I mean, here in Canada, at least, for some reason they want you to love being Canadian, but hate, when you have this patriotic nationalist kind of sentiment. Canada's the best, Canada's number one, and they say, no, 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 listen, that's very dangerous. This is how the fascism starts. And as soon as
Yeah.
and they don't want you to be a Canadian first. They want to, like, they'll encourage identities, like, for example, I don't know, Portuguese Canadian, or Indo Canadian, or Aboriginal Canadian. Well, heck, they don't even want you to be Aboriginal Canadians. They just want you to be Aboriginal First Nations.
Yeah, well,
Um,
it's ironic that whenever a person asks me about like my heritage, I just say, "Oh, I'm a German American," and it gives me bonus points
yeah,
in
it's
my conversation. It's hilarious. I don't even understand why it does, but just like the mere fact that I can be like a something American makes me like special in some way. It's very strange.
It does, and this is the funny thing. Whereas we in, Canada and the United States are losing that sense of identity, that national spirit, which, drove our forefathers. You go, I have to use this as an example, and I'm sorry, but you go to South America, you go to Peru, when I go to Peru, you say to them, what are you? And they just look at you and you just go, I'm a Peruvian. That's all I am. I love my country, and they're fiercely patriotic people. You go to most South American countries, you even look at the Venezuelans, despite everything that they've been through, they still love their country. They're still Venezuelans first. You see the street, street vendors in Lima who are Venezuelans. They've got Venezuelan hats and shirts. They love it. They're
Mhm.
still proud of their country despite what it has become. And whereas us, we could learn from them, to be honest, because their nationalism, as it were, isn't this toxic thing to be treated with disdain. It's honestly something to be inspiring. It's something to be inspired by, because you see them and you see this, their pride. Honestly, Joanna, Intermezzo, I like to this is why I like South America so much, and this is why, you and other people who know me have heard me
Mhm.
speak about it with such affinity, because they have this way of instilling this pride and this spirit. I know the Peruvian national anthem better than I know the Canadian one, and that's sad, and I'm the first to admit it.
Mhm.
But it's just that spirit around it is so inspiring that it brings you, to a whole other level. And we've lost that. And it's honestly hard to get back,
Yeah.
if at all possible. I mean, it's something that would take, I believe, generations of instilling into people.
Yeah, I think it's going to be like, and I think this is one of the reasons why I find religion so appealing, is because it kind of gives you this sense of a greater purpose that really is inspiring. So if you're familiar with some of the Bible, you'll know that Jesus quotes Leviticus, when he's tempted by the devil. I believe
Mhm.
it's Leviticus. It might be Deuteronomy, but he says, man does not live by bread alone. And I feel like that is really what our societies are missing. And of course, this is what corporations, people in my class who are very materialistic, that's what they don't want you to know. That's what people who run the stock markets don't want people to really identify with, that they can have an identity that's something other than corporate, that's something other than transient, that's something bigger than themselves, really. Just this notion that maybe there's something more. Maybe it's okay if you don't spend all your material money that you earn. Maybe there is something worth saving for. Maybe it's not okay. Like maybe there's something more or more important in your life than simply working for a company. And
Yeah.
I feel like specifically like when I was on a college campus, this is utterly missing. And you go talk to people, and they just, you ask them what they aspire to be, and for the most part, they'll say, "Oh, I don't know, but I'll find a job somewhere." But you always note that, that are, I mean, like they try to aspire to, some of them will claim to be, a history major or a philosophy major, and they'll say, "Oh, I'm well-rounded in some regard," but then eventually they work for some company and they live kind of a boring life. And it's kind of obsessed about like moving to a suburb, like earning material shit, and really not having anything greater than themselves to really live for, unless it's like a social justice warrior thing. And then it's kind of like a transient identity where, it's something where, oh, I can go live this identity through my politics where I vote once, or, oh, I can live this identity through like protesting, or I can live this identity by telling all my friends about how noble I am because I fight for this cause or another.
But isn't this more of a more of an illusion? Because I mean, really, they're not doing. I mean, it's just this. It's essentially bragging rights and nothing more.
It's a complete delusion. Of course, they have no idea. Like, I mean, it is a complete self-delusion on their part that they believe that they're fighting for something nobler than themselves, but they don't know what the hell they're fighting for. It's kind of like all the women who wear the pink hats again. And it's ironic. My mom makes more than my dad, and my mom doesn't really feel the need to go participate in these events because she knows like she's earned her way to where she is.
Yeah, yeah, definitely.
And
And I just want to touch on one thing, regarding democracy there, because we kind of gone off the beaten path a little bit.
oh yeah.
Um, but I mean, this is all just, a good bit of fun, between two friends having a good conversation, which I mean, I find that whenever me and you chat, either, in a streamer or offline, it's always an enlightening experience.
Yeah.
But you've heard Cicero once say, "The sinews of war are infinite money."
Mhm.
I believe it's the same for democracy or for politics, because everything in politics at the end of the day is about money, which is part of that which rather disillusions me a little bit and disappoints me because
Well, yeah. I would have a slight disagreement there, but go ahead.
oh, well, the way I see it is that, at the end of the day, every focus is on, if you're a politician, at the end of the day, your main focus is raising money for your next campaign. And that's
Yeah.
the problem with democratic society, because and it's true, especially in the United States. I mean, your congressmen and senators somehow raise obscene amounts of money. I mean, millions upon millions, whereas here we're allowed to spend like $84,000, which for us is significant. But either way, I mean, it's that money, and I find that with democracy, when you donate a certain amount of money, I mean, and I'm not talking about $20 or 100. I'm talking about 10 to 15 to 20 to on and on thousands of dollars. You're not generally giving that money because you believe in the candidate or the party, or you believe that you're doing something for the greater good. You're making that sacrifice. And now I could be wrong. I might be wrong, but you're generally doing it with the expectation that you're going to, it's going to benefit you some way, shape, or form, be it uh, a one-on-one with the politician, or the leadership, The impression that what they're going to do is going to benefit you personally, be it contracts, bids, certain services, maybe lower taxes for your certain branch of industry.
Mhm.
It's all under that, and the politicians will, not all of them. I know some good people who aren't taken in by the money, but
Mhm.
I know plenty of people who are so desperate to be reelected and to keep on that feel good gravy train because they want the benefits, they want the power, they want the influence, they
Mhm.
want the respectability. So
Mhm.
they will take the money. And once you take the money from these corporate entities or from rather well-to-do private individuals, they own you. Whether you think they don't, whether you believe they do or not, they own you in some way, shape, or form because they can command, you know, uh, something with you, be it an audience or what have you. And so that's where I believe we've gone off the rails as a democracy, either here in Canada or in the United States or really any democracy. The end of the day, the weakness is money. It's
Yeah. So I think my caveats, I think it is more the perception of money. So I think that would be part of it. A second like caveat I would add is that, and you perhaps know this better than I do, but what does money do for your political process?
Well, it pays for the ads, it pays for travel expenses,
Exposure,
signage.
right?
Exactly. Yes, yes, exposure.
So really, money is simply a way of bribing the media to cover you.
It is. It is.
So that's one of the reasons why Donald Trump was able to win in the United States. He actually didn't raise the most money. Hillary Clinton easily raised significantly more money than he did. But because Donald Trump was covered by the media so frequently, he was able to get exposure to win the election.
Yes.
So really, what this money is just a way of essentially bribing the media. And this is like my theory when it comes to government. It's he who controls the media controls the country. So I wouldn't be surprised if in the future that really more liberal politicians win, respectively of how much money they earn. And I think they probably will earn more money, but it's going to be because I wouldn't be surprised if they get more coverage by the media
No,
in
no,
that
no.
way.
I agree with you to an extent,
Yeah.
but I see the other problem with it is that you don't even really have to have a plan to win an election. And I've seen it in so many different places. Um, a party comes out and they just say, well, we're going to use insert standard talking point A, taxes. We're going to lower taxes. We're we're not really going to tell you how much we're going to lower them or when we're going to lower them, but someday we just might. So you give us a chance. Um, and people will just say, oh well, I'm not going to ask any other questions. I just believe they're going to lower my taxes. But I find, and I'm sure you've seen it. I mean, you're a very intelligent man, and you
Yeah.
you do keep an eye on things. When you want to vote for a candidate, you want to know, what the plan is. I do. I can't say that I'm as educated as you, but I mean, I try not to brag or anything, but I'm not
But you
an
know the
I'm not
political process much more than I do. So,
I am, and I'm consider myself to be rather clever. So I don't just take the product without paying for it. I want to look at what it consists of, and that's what I find is another weakness with democracy is that people don't really want to read the plan. They don't want to read the platform or the policy. They in at least in Canada and in my province especially, we have this thing where we just go and vote for just the party. I mean, we
mhm.
coalesce around the leader generally. I mean, that's the way it is in Canada. You look at Justin Trudeau. I mean, we didn't. Most people don't vote for their members of parliament because they think they're wonderful or they're going to stand up for them. They vote because they know that if they get enough seats in parliament, that leader of the party is going to be the prime minister, and they don't really care anything else. They just want to see that this one individual is to that pinnacle. And really, they don't have to have a plan. I've worked on a couple of campaigns. I've worked on them for, especially, in my younger years. I'm loath to admit it, but I worked for I campaigned for the Liberal Party of Canada, and they didn't really have a plan. It was essentially, some pretty sounding numbers, but nothing else. There was no real substance. And the thing is about political policy, it can change on a whim. 1 minute, the government was saying that they were against the pipelines because they were going to build the transnational, I think it was a transnational pipeline. It was an Enron pipeline. It was big.
Yeah.
And then it turned out that there was a lot of protest. There was a lot of furor over it, mostly, and curse you Americans for doing this, the American funded, anti-petroleum lobby, the anti-oil and the environmental groups funneled cash into Canada. And so Enron pulled out. I think it was Enron. Or whoever it was. I'm really not too up and up on it. I'm pretty sure it was Enbridge. I'm sorry. Enron was that weird company back in the day. The transnational pipeline they were going to build, or Trans Mountain. Long story short, Enbridge was going to pull out, and so the Canadian government just recently said, no, listen, we're going to buy the pipeline project from you. We're going to buy the expansion. They have just spent $4.5 billion on this pipeline that they said that they wanted to be done in a certain way. They were against it before. Trudeau was big anti-pipeline, but now they've bought it. And the funny thing is that the Canadian courts have said they can't build this pipeline anyway because it violated X amount of agreements with First Nations groups. And that's something that disillusions me because, one, even though I don't agree with the Trudeau government, they should have stuck to their principles, even if it hurts, because hypocrisy is always a terrible thing. And two, I just damn well don't think the government should be buying up money for personal projects. We've seen it in my province for a long time, but it things like this contribute to a lack of democratic participation, because I know plenty of people who just don't vote. They don't want to get out and vote because they feel like nothing is going to change, and I'm sure that's a sentiment that you can share.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I agree. But I think, I think to your earlier point that people just, they don't vote for people based upon really policy positions. They vote for people based upon slogans and what color they wear. I mean, and you can't really build a democracy on that. Or really, I mean, how democratic is your democracy going to be? Your republic going to be based upon that? And the correct answer is not going to be very representative. It's not going to be very effective. And part of this is just because I don't think most people can really understand the political positions, or really, yeah, they can't understand the political positions enough to have an opinion on them. They don't understand all the ramifications of all the different positions that they can take. So, and it's always kind of like whenever I talk politics with another person, and almost invariably it's a liberal person, I always bring up a lot of points that they haven't even considered. And they, in general, they respect me because I'm a good guy and I try to be a good person. And they know that. And so they know that I'm not just trying to get them or something, but I do bring up a lot of points that, it kind of, it makes you wonder about, all this, people really just vote based upon the slogan. It's a lot of sloganeering. And that's true on both the right and the left. I don't think that that's really, that one side uses it more than the other. But I think it just makes you a bit more delusioned with democracy when it's just too easy to just come up with a slogan to kind of And it almost makes you it really feels like you're just watching a football game and you're just in the crowd cheering. And in theory, your vote means something, but you're just cheering for whichever football team is playing on the football field.
And that's very, very true. Um, it's hard though to watch the way things are going and how empty it is. And I mean, it really brings up a question that some people have mentioned to me before. And I mean, this is a controversial thing to say, but is universal suffrage really all it's cracked up to be? Should everybody, and I'm not saying like am I saying that women shouldn't have the vote? It's not that. I'm just saying is that should there be a certain classification or certain, point where you have to reach in order to have that privilege of voting? In the past you had to own land, you had to be, of a certain group. I'm not against, you know, women voting. That's perfectly fine with me. It's just that I feel that other things, there should be other criteria because
Yeah. I agree with you, and this is actually one of the reasons. Like, I know inevitably, like, it's going to resort to the sloganeering regardless, but I do think it can be it can be utilized in a way to make it better. So, for example, I do think that people do take a look at the issues to a degree. They just don't take a very close look at them. In general, in my opinion, and this depends upon what your theory of government is. So, in my theory of government, I kind of believe that it's supposed to establish essentially a country that can stand the test of time and be, kind of like can build a stable society so that my children, my grandchildren, my great grandchildren, and so forth down the line, that all my descendants will have some stability to kind of be able to, live the kind of life that gives them meaning. And I think most people today, at least in my class, who don't have children yet, they kind of view government as essentially this helpful organization to help people of today. And I kind of wonder if it would be perhaps prudent. And I know this is never going to be passed because, this would be just too unpopular, but would be prudent if only people who had children were permitted to vote in for government office, because they actually have an incentive to care about the future. I really care about the future, but then again, I don't have children at the moment. And so that would, like, despite the fact that it would hinder my voting chances, and despite the fact that I would probably, I would vote for something that is good for the long term, enough people without children just don't have that same incentive. And so therefore, it would be prudent for society that wishes to last a long time for them to restrict the franchise to people with children or people who have an investment in the country.
Well, I mean, or people who have, I mean, you can extend that argument to people in business, landowners of a certain size, all these different interest groups, would have that, should have that, interest in the country, because at the end of the day, it is. I mean, having a business is, in a sense, like having a family. You want it to you want to nurture it and grow it and make sure that it's secure and stable. So one can make the argument that, you know, there's a lot of different groups that you can extend the franchise to. Now, as someone who appreciates democracy like myself and who is still trying his best to be optimistic about it, despite everything that I have seen, I still have faith in, universal franchise, but I'm merely just throwing out the arguments, you know what I mean, to
Yeah.
facilitate this discussion, because it is fascinating, and
Yeah.
maybe in the future we'll have to touch upon it again
Mhm.
in another stream.
Yeah.
But you know, you can really make the argument that these people have the say, or maybe even restricting the politicians we elect to, I don't know, certain business owners. Families, should it be done up in blocks? Different groups get a certain amount of representation in a parliamentary system. Because I know in New Zealand they have it. You have like the Maori have a certain amount of representation, and they say that Chinese community, I believe, has a certain amount of representation.
Mm-hmm.
You can do that, but that at the same time is dangerous too. It opens up sectarian issues. But I think what you say I can see, because children, you want to have a say in a place that where your children can grow and prosper. But
Mm-hmm.
does that not polarize society a bit more? Does that not have that class that, or increase the, as a socialist would say, the inequalities?
How would it increase the inequalities? Doesn't everybody eventually? Isn't everybody born of a family?
They are, but at the same time, not everyone wants to have a family, or not everyone is even capable of it. As you, as a medical professional, know, there are infertile people. If you should you be denied certain things if you can't reproduce out of your own ability, as you know.
You could argue that, and there are two solutions to the problem. The first solution is that, yes, because they can't have children, they still don't have that same incentive that a person who does have children has. So therefore, that is fair under the system. And the second one is that you could go get the approval of a physician who knows that they've been trying to conceive and knows that they're infertile, and therefore would give them kind of a pass, if you will.
Or even adoption.
Or adoption. Agreed. If you adopt a child, then that fulfills that benefit as well. And I would wholeheartedly agree with that. But I do think families are, I'm very, very big on families and how they truly are really the source of culture, where they are the source of really what drives a civilization. Right now, I'm actually reading a book called The First Society by Scott Hahn, which really describes this to a remarkably good degree, I think, where he depicts the family as essentially the core unit, the Lego of society. And if you tear down the family, the society kind of goes with it. And so I think that, people might say, oh, but I don't want to have a family. Well, maybe this will give you an incentive to do so. And when you have an incentive to do so, maybe that will give you an incentive to care more about future generations as well.
And I agree with you there as well. And I think, though, also, for places with, that declining birth rate, or a birth rate that is, unsustainable as is, I think it comes down to the actions of your government as well. Because, for example, where I live, they've built a hydroelectric dam up in our northern part of our province, on the land, on the continental portion. And long story short, they've bungled it immensely, and now our electricity rates are going to double, if not triple. So most people are going to, and there's really no other options, because there's only one power generating organization here, and that's the government. The government generates our power, and a private company, in essentially symbiotic monopoly with them, distributes the power. But most people, for me, for example, I'm concerned to have children now. I'd love to have a family, but I can't afford it here. There's the wages are too low, and that's not necessarily bad, because unless the taxes were lower to enable me to have more saving power. But it's hard to save when you're paying, say, $400 to $600 a month for your light bill, especially in winter, when your power generally doubles automatically your consumption. So I think that having an interest in democracy and in your future, and in the future prosperity of your nation, comes down to the things like that, like lowering taxes, making the place, livable, and making you enjoy it. Because I mean, you can scream about, it's your home, it's your culture, it's your history, all you want, but if it's unsustainable to stay there, I mean, my God, you'll have to leave either way. I mean,
But I do have something for you. So you're saying that the electrical bill is too high because of these essentially corporate monopolies. So if only people with families were permitted to vote, which means that only people who could afford families were able to vote, wouldn't these people who are struggling, who are trying to build families, but finding out that it's too expensive, wouldn't they argue to break up these companies to make the electrical bill cheaper?
It would be if it was any other different circumstance, but the way things were here, it was essentially a Bush Gulf War II scenario where we were fed the information to believe that everything was sorted out, that they had a plan ahead, that this was going to be profitable at the end of the day. It wasn't going to cost $14 billion. It was only going to cost $5. We were essentially sold a story, and that story turned into a nightmare. So really, at the end of the day, that vote, those families would have voted for it anyway, because I mean, who doesn't want to have energy security? I mean, that's part of like what we said earlier in the stream. Whereas people, they want to be comfortable, they want to be safe and secure, and what's more secure generally than having heat and lights? So we bought into this illusion, and then when we finally woke up and looked out the window and saw the house is on, or looked around the room and the house is on fire, it was too late. So that also gives you, at the end of the day, that weakness in democracy that we've talked about, and it does tie into The Logic of Terror by Mario Vargas Llosa, where it's allowed, whereas democracy, it's essentially soft. It's soft on everything, because in the pursuit to maintain itself, to give the illusion that everything is free, that everything is good and wonderful, and this, we ignore the underlying problems, or at least we ignore them. And I mean, it's even like George Orwell said at the end of Homage to Catalonia, which is a wonderful book if you've ever read it. I'm just gonna find it. I've got the book literally right in my hand. He is just talking about like how he felt after he got out of Spain after the Civil War, and if you don't mind, I can just read it to you rather quickly and get your opinion. Says, let me see. And then England, southern England, probably the sleekest landscape in the world. It is difficult when you pass that way, especially when you are peacefully recovering from the seasickness with the plush cushions of a boat train carriage underneath you, to believe that anything is really happening anywhere. Earthquakes in Japan, famines in China, revolutions in Mexico. Don't worry. The milk will still be on the doorstep tomorrow morning. The New Statesman will come out on Friday. The industrial towns were far away, a smudge of smoke and misery hidden by the curve of the Earth's surface. Down here, it was still the England that I had known in my childhood. The railway cuttings smothered in wildflowers, the deep meadows where the great shining horses browse and meditate, the slow-moving streams bordered by willows, the green bosoms of the elms, the larkspurs in the cottage gardens, and then the huge, peaceful wilderness of outer London, the barges on the miry river, the familiar streets, the posters telling of cricket matches and royal weddings, the men in bowler hats, the pigeons in Trafalgar Square, the red buses, the blue policemen, all sleeping the deep, deep sleep of England, from which I sometimes fear that we shall never wake till we are jerked out of it by the roar of bombs. And I think what he's saying there is true. And I mean, that also ties into that essay, because right now, the United States and Canada, for example, are asleep. And we're dreaming this dream. We still think that Canada and America are how they were in the 70s and the 80s.
Mhm.
There we still think that everything is, idealistic, but in reality, I mean, somebody's getting ready to fire a bomb through the window.
Yeah. Mhm.
Um, so
No,
uh,
no, I agree. It's interesting to talk to the like to my older patients who's just say, "Hey, why did America get this crazy?" And like they just don't have any understanding of what's going on.
no,
And they
it's this.
live, they still like, because especially for like older Americans, like older Americans are actually treated fairly well, depending. I mean, like there are obviously caveats to this, but with Social Security and Medicare, like Medicare is a very, very good. Uh, it's very good insurance, despite what many people would say. Um, but like I think it's not going to last, sadly, just because of increased medical costs and just because of other factors. It, but I think that they're kind of isolated from it, from the problem. Like, and everybody over the age of 40 is really isolated from the problems that are affecting us. And so I kind of feel like most people in their 20s or 30s, specifically who are not in the upper middle class, are really not isolated from like really the economic depressions that we're suffering from this loss of really American identity, and from overall like general like not knowing what to do.
No, no,
I do agree with the
I agree.
sentiment. Most of America is still sleeping, and I don't know when she will be awoken. But
I'm actually scared when it will be, because I mean, it's a dream that I'd like to stay into as well, but I mean, it's the Matrix. You think you're in reality, but it's actually much darker underneath.
yeah,
Um,
well, I don't see anything to fear from it. What
Not
will
yet.
happen. Well, not yet. Like I don't think that American society, is going to be the same. It's going to be like this 19, where everybody believes that we're in the 1990s and everything's, the stock market's going up and we kind of pretend that things are going well. Like even in the upper middle class, where that essentially is still true to a degree. I don't think that's going to last forever in my lifetime, but even then, what happens happens, and you need to make the best decisions for what you do in the time that you're given. And maybe this is just because I see, just in my life, I see mortality every day. I see people suffer. I see, like, I see kind of. So when you're talking about, oh, it's going to be difficult to raise a family, when you talk about, oh, I fear for the future of society when, there's going to be some revolution or whenever something like that happens. It, like just 2 weeks ago, I had a patient who had testicular cancer on the right testicle, and he was treated for it. And that was 5 years ago. And it was a particular type of testicular cancer, and it was well treated and it was gone. Just about 2 weeks ago, or about a month ago, he came into the hospital with abdominal pain and stuff like that. We took a look at him, and we found a bunch of metastases to his lungs, to his liver, to his intestines, all over
Oh,
the place. And we took a biopsy, and it was testicular cancer, but it was a different type, and it was on the other testicle that was not removed. And
oh,
so like imagine that person at the age of 25, and he's still hanging in there. He's still trying to hang in there. But just imagine that, and so I see these stories on a daily basis. And so when people tell me, oh, I'm so worried about the future, anything can happen at any time. And my suggestion is just make the best decisions that you can. Be bold, be brave, be courageous, do what you can do, and whatever, a lot of it's up to God. A lot of it you don't have control over it, and there's no real, you have to live your life like you're going to live your life. You need to live a good life. And so if you feel like you're called to have children, even though you kind of feel like you're pressed for cash, I would recommend doing it if that's what you feel you're called to do.
no,
um,
yeah,
yeah, if you feel like oh no, there's something terrible going in our society, raise a stink about it. Go talk about it. Tell other people about it, because at the end of the day, life is very transient, and nobody makes it out of life alive. You're gonna be there's going to be a lot of terrible things that happen on in your life that you're not going to have any control over. But that's just life, and you can't live in that fear.
No, and I completely agree. And like you said earlier, your perspective, based on what you go through as a doctor on a regular basis. I mean, that's why I enjoy speaking to you, because you have that different perspective. You have that view on life, as it were, that makes it so interesting to talk with you.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree wholeheartedly with you.
Mm-hmm.
You're completely right. Um, it's all we can do is just live and treat each day as it comes. I mean, it's too hard or too really impossible to predict how anything will go. I mean, life is as volatile as the stock market. It can be an absolute boom one minute, and the next minute it can be Venezuela. you know
Yeah.
it, it's that. But I think, it's we've been doing this for about an hour and a half. I think it's probably about time to wrap it on up.
Yep.
But I just want to thank you so much for taking the time to come on and discuss this with me. It's been enlightening, to be honest, and I thank you.
Yeah. No, I very much enjoyed talking with you, and thank you for having me on.
No problem. We'll have to have you on again soon, especially on my other podcast. Actually, I think you'd enjoy it. So with that, I'm gonna pop this off. So I wish everyone who's listening, have a good night, and thank you for tuning in.